The warship descended like a dark shadow over the quiet human colony. The rumble of its engines vibrated through the earth, sending shivers down the spines of the colonists below. The small settlement, once peaceful and untouched by the chaos of the galaxy, now stood on the edge of disaster. It was a place of innocence, where children laughed in the fields and families lived in simple harmony. But the calm of the colony was shattered as the warship's massive form eclipsed the sun, blocking out the light and casting everything into an eerie twilight. From the moment the ship touched down, everything seemed to go wrong. The sky darkened further, and the air seemed thick with tension, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Soldiers clad in dark, battle-worn armor began to emerge from the ship, their eyes cold and unfeeling. They were a race of conquerors, feared across the stars for their ruthlessness and strength. They moved with precision, as if they had done this countless times before. Their leader, the warlord Vrax, stepped down from the ramp, his eyes scanning the land before him. He was tall and imposing, with sharp features and a presence that commanded attention. His face was carved from stone, unyielding and emotionless. Vrax had come to claim the child. He had heard the rumors, the stories whispered in the darkest corners of space. But Vrax wasn't one to believe in ancient warnings or superstitions. He had conquered hundreds of worlds, destroyed countless civilizations, and seen things that would break the mind of any lesser being. The idea that a human child, one simple, innocent girl, could hold power enough to destroy him or his empire seemed laughable. But the warning had been clear: touch a human child, and the universe will crumble. Vrax chuckled at the thought. It's just a myth, he thought, a story to keep the weak in line. He ordered his soldiers to find the girl. The humans had clearly been warned for generations about this very event, but they hadn't taken the threat seriously. The colony, though small and remote, had been home to a rare and ancient bloodline, one that had carried with it an incredible power, a force that was older than time itself. The child, as he was told, was the key to unlocking this power. He had no idea what she truly was, but he intended to take her, bring her back to his empire, and use her power for his own gain. The soldiers spread out across the settlement, their boots thundering against the ground. People screamed and ran for shelter, their panic palpable in the air. The humans had no weapons, no means to defend themselves against such an overwhelming force. They were defenseless, and they knew it. A few brave souls tried to fight back, but they were quickly overpowered by the superior strength and technology of the alien invaders. Vrax's forces had begun their search. It wasn't long before they found her. The child was sitting alone, seemingly unaware of the danger that was rapidly closing in. She was a quiet, unassuming girl with golden hair and wide, innocent eyes. She had been playing near the fields, lost in her own world, when the soldiers found her. One of them reached out to grab her arm, but the moment his hand made contact with her skin, something happened. A strange, unnatural energy pulsed through the air, vibrating the ground beneath them. The soldier froze, his face contorted in confusion and fear. The energy in the air seemed to thicken, crackling with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Vrax, who had been observing from a distance, narrowed his eyes. He had expected resistance, but this was something different. He watched as the soldier stumbled back, eyes wide in horror, unable to speak. The child's eyes glowed faintly, almost imperceptibly at first, but that was enough. Vrax felt a chill run down his spine as he realized something was terribly wrong. The soldiers were backing away from the child now, their fear growing, but it was too late. The power that had been dormant for so long was awakening, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Vrax could see it now. The child was no longer just a human girl. There was something far greater hidden within her. The power that flowed through her was ancient, a force that had been sealed away for centuries, perhaps even longer. It was a power that connected her to something beyond the stars, something beyond the understanding of any being, human or alien. In an instant, the ground trembled beneath them, and the sky above seemed to darken even further. The ships in the distance, once silent and still, suddenly began to emit strange energy readings. The warlord's own ship, designed to be invincible, shuddered as if it too were affected by the growing power around them. It was as if the very fabric of reality itself was beginning to tear. Systems started malfunctioning. Lights flickered, and Vrax's soldiers looked around in confusion. The feeling of dread intensified. Vrax's heart began to pound. He had never encountered anything like this before. The child wasn't just a target. She was the key to something far beyond his comprehension, a power he was not prepared for. "What have I done?" he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the crackling energy in the air. The child's power was now fully unleashed, and the sky above them rippled with unnatural force. The universe was reacting, the balance being disturbed in a way that no one had foreseen. The peaceful colony, once so serene, had become the epicenter of something far larger than anyone could have imagined. Vrax's arrogance had led him here, to this moment of realization. His desire to control the child, to bend her power to his will, had opened a door he couldn't close. And as he looked up, he knew that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The warning that had been dismissed as nonsense was true. And now, it was too late. The child, still seated in the field, stood up slowly, her eyes still glowing faintly. The moment she moved, the air around her seemed to ripple, and the ground trembled once again. The warlord, his hands clenched into fists, watched in stunned silence. There was no turning back. The universe had been set into motion, and no one, especially not him, could stop what was coming next. The warship's descent was silent, yet it carried with it a weight that seemed to press down on the entire human colony. Its immense size blocked out the sun, casting a long shadow that stretched over the quiet settlement below. The rumble of its engines vibrated through the ground, making the earth tremble beneath the feet of the terrified colonists. The peaceful world, untouched by the chaos of the galaxy, was now on the brink of destruction. People stopped in their tracks, looking up in disbelief as the alien craft loomed overhead. The atmosphere grew heavy with tension, and fear began to spread like wildfire among the humans. They had heard the stories, the whispers of an ancient warning, but no one had taken them seriously. They never thought a day like this would come. From the belly of the warship, soldiers clad in dark, menacing armor emerged. They moved with military precision, their movements deliberate and cold. These were not beings of mercy or kindness, but conquerors, feared throughout the galaxy for their ruthless efficiency. Leading them was Vrax, a warlord whose name alone sent shivers down the spines of those who had encountered him. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the colony below with a detached curiosity. He had come for one thing: the child. The ancient warning that had echoed through the ages had reached his ears, but he dismissed it as a myth, a superstition created by weak, fearful minds. He had ruled over countless worlds and destroyed entire civilizations. What could a human child possibly do to him? The soldiers spread out quickly, moving with purpose. The colony, small and defenseless, had no chance. People screamed and fled, running for shelter as the aliens began their search. They had no weapons capable of standing against the advanced technology of the invaders. Panic swept through the streets as families barricaded themselves in their homes, praying they wouldn't be found. In the chaos, one child, no older than 6 or 7, sat quietly in a field, unaware of the approaching danger. Her golden hair shimmered in the dim light, and her eyes, wide and innocent, gazed at the sky as if in search of something beyond the horizon. She had no idea that her life, and the fate of the galaxy, was about to change. Vrax's soldiers found her quickly. One of them reached down to grab her, his hand extended toward her small arm. As his fingers brushed against her skin, the air around them seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, like a faint tremor in the atmosphere, but then it grew stronger. A wave of energy surged through the air, thickening the very fabric of reality itself. The soldier who had touched her froze. His body went stiff, and his face twisted in confusion, as if his mind couldn't comprehend what was happening. The others backed away, eyes wide with fear. Something was wrong. The child, once just a helpless figure, was now radiating an unimaginable power. Vrax, who had been watching from a distance, narrowed his eyes. He had expected resistance, but this was something entirely different. He could feel the shift in the air, the subtle but undeniable change. The child was no longer just a little girl. She was the source of something much larger, something that seemed to be tied to the universe itself. His thoughts raced, but before he could make sense of what was happening, the ground beneath him trembled. The warship, designed to be an indestructible force, shuddered. Systems began to malfunction. Lights flickered and alarms blared, but there was no time to stop them. The sky above seemed to darken even further, and the once clear air grew thick with an unnatural charge. The child's eyes began to glow faintly, and the energy around her surged. It wasn't just her presence, it was the very essence of her being, a force that had been dormant for eons, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Vrax's heart raced as he realized that this was not just a child. This was the key to something ancient, something far beyond his comprehension. The power she wielded was beyond anything he had ever faced. The warlord's soldiers, once fearless in the face of battle, now recoiled in terror. The very world around them seemed to be fighting back, as if the universe itself was rising in defense of this child. The air around the child crackled with an energy that distorted everything it touched. The ground beneath their feet began to warp and shake. Time itself felt like it was stretching, bending. The sky rippled like a pool of water disturbed by a stone. Vrax's warship, once a symbol of unstoppable power, was now helpless in the face of this force. His soldiers shouted orders to each other, but the commands were useless. Their weapons malfunctioned. Their communication systems went silent. Nothing worked. The ship's engines sputtered, failing to respond to the commands of its crew. The warlord's control over the situation was slipping, and with it, his confidence. The child's power grew stronger with every passing moment, and the tension in the air was palpable. Vrax's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. Was this a trap? Had they underestimated the humans? No, this was something different, something far more dangerous. The child was not just a symbol of humanity's innocence. She was the embodiment of a power that could reshape the galaxy, a force that could tear apart the fabric of the universe if it was disturbed. And Vrax had disturbed it. His arrogance had led him here, to this moment of realization. He had underestimated the strength of the human race. He had underestimated the force of the warning he had so casually dismissed. As the child stood up, her small form barely visible in the growing chaos around her, Vrax felt a chill crawl up his spine. The warlord, once unshakable, realized that he had made the gravest mistake of his life. The universe was no longer under his control. The child's power was awakening, and with it, the consequences of ignoring the warning were about to unfold in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. The moment the child stood, the air around her seemed to crackle with an invisible energy that made the very ground tremble beneath her feet. Vrax could feel it, a deep primal force surging through the atmosphere, warping reality itself. He had expected some resistance, perhaps a few skirmishes, but this was beyond his understanding. The sky above them seemed to darken even further, as if a storm had gathered. But there was no wind. It was the energy, the power radiating from the child, that caused the disturbance. For the first time since landing, Vrax felt fear, a cold, gnawing fear that threatened to overtake him. The soldiers, once so confident and sure of their victory, were now hesitant. Their weapons malfunctioned in their hands. Blasters that should have been ready to fire sputtered and died. Communication systems buzzed, sending out unintelligible static instead of orders. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. They tried to regroup, but the energy in the air was suffocating. The warlord's empire had conquered countless worlds, annihilated entire civilizations, and yet Here he was, standing before a child, someone he had thought would be no more than an obstacle to his plans, facing a force he could neither control nor comprehend. The child's eyes were glowing now, her small frame almost entirely consumed by the ethereal light. It wasn't just her eyes. It was as if the very essence of her being had become a conduit for something ancient, something vast and untouchable. The ground beneath her feet began to ripple like the surface of a lake disturbed by a stone. Energy pulses shot out from her, small at first, but they began to grow. Vrax watched, frozen, as the pulses collided with the warship above them. The colossal ship shuddered violently, as if struck by an unseen hand. The hull groaned and creaked under the pressure. The massive engines, once humming with power, now sputtered and hissed, their lights flickering on and off. The warlord's pride, the invincible warship, was failing. "Stop her!" Vrax barked, his voice full of panic. He tried to regain control, to rally his forces, but it was useless. His soldiers were paralyzed with fear, unable to react. They were trapped in the grip of a force beyond their comprehension. Every attempt to fire their weapons was futile. Every movement seemed sluggish, as though the very fabric of time itself was bending, warping under the child's power. Vrax gritted his teeth. He was no stranger to facing danger, no stranger to battle. But this was something else entirely. The energy emanating from the child had a presence to it, as though the universe itself was watching. The warlord's mind raced. The old legends, the warnings, the myths about humans had always been laughed off as stories, as mere superstition. But now, in the face of this unimaginable power, he understood that they were not just stories. They were a warning. The galaxy had underestimated humanity, and he had paid the price. He tried to focus, tried to think clearly, but the air around him felt thick, pressing down on him, warping his thoughts. The child's power was no longer just a strange anomaly. It was becoming more and more real with every passing second. The ground beneath them cracked, and the sky above them flickered as if reality itself was on the verge of collapsing. A strange noise, like a low hum, filled the air, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the very core of Vrax's being. It was not a sound he could place. It was as though the universe itself was responding to the child's power. The warship began to sway, its once sturdy hull groaning, as if it were being twisted by invisible hands. The ship's engines flared and died, and with them, the ship began to drift slowly in midair, its systems no longer responding to the commands of Vrax's crew. It was a terrifying sight. The warlord's jaw clenched as he understood what was happening. The power of this child, this seemingly innocent human girl, was not just destroying his fleet. It was unraveling the very fabric of their technology, of everything they had built. It was as if the child was rewriting the laws of reality itself. "Retreat!" Vrax shouted, finally losing all hope of controlling the situation. His voice cracked as the words escaped him, and he felt a sense of helplessness, unlike anything he had ever known. He was not a man accustomed to retreating. But this was beyond his ability to command. "Get back to the ship. Now," he ordered his soldiers. But even as he spoke, he could see their hesitance. They were frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. The child, now fully glowing with an otherworldly light, was a force far greater than any of them could handle. As the soldiers scrambled to retreat, Vrax turned toward the child, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of rage and desperation. He was a warlord, a conqueror, not some powerless pawn. But in this moment he realized that he had never been more powerless. He had underestimated humanity, and now he was about to pay the price. The child's energy surged, and in that moment it was as if time itself had stopped. Everything around them seemed to freeze. The air, the earth, even the stars above. Vrax felt his heart stop, and his breath caught in his throat. The universe was aligning, responding to the child's power, To the ancient force that had awakened in her, it was as though the universe itself had been waiting for this moment. And now that it had arrived, Vrax realized there was no escape. His fleet was already doomed, his soldiers were lost, and he was just a small, insignificant being caught in a force too vast to comprehend. The child raised her hand slowly, and with that simple movement, the entire warship, his pride and joy, began to break apart. The hull cracked, and the ship groaned under the strain of the power tearing it apart. Vrax could only watch in horror as his empire crumbled before him, as the universe itself began to unravel under the child's command. And then, with a final, blinding pulse of light, everything went dark. The warship, the soldiers, the colony, all of it disappeared into nothingness. The child's power had completed its task, and the universe had shifted. But the message was clear. The warning had been ignored. And now, the consequences were beyond anything the galaxy could have imagined. The silence that followed was deafening. The once thriving colony, the warship, and the soldiers who had invaded all disappeared into nothingness, swallowed by a force beyond comprehension. For a brief moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath, as if in awe of what had just transpired. The stars above, once twinkling in peaceful serenity, were now eerily still. The air was thick, heavy with an energy that lingered long after the destruction had taken place. And then, a ripple, a subtle wave of energy that spread outward, as if the universe itself was taking a step back to assess what had occurred. It wasn't just the child's power that had shifted the balance of reality. It was the understanding that something ancient, something vast, had been set into motion. The consequences of that power were not yet fully understood, but one thing was certain: the galaxy had been irrevocably changed. The laws of physics, of time and space, seemed to bend and warp around this moment. The child, standing in the middle of the field, seemed untouched by the cataclysm she had unleashed. Her golden hair shimmered softly in the dim light, her small hands still held before her, as though she were summoning something far beyond her grasp. Her eyes, still glowing with that eerie, otherworldly light, were fixed on the horizon, as though seeing something no one else could. She was a child, yes, but in that moment she was more than human. She was something else, something older, something that had always been there, waiting for the right time to awaken. Her parents, along with the remaining survivors of the colony, had taken shelter in their homes, fearful of the invaders and the destruction that followed. They had witnessed the arrival of the warship, the terror it brought, and then the inexplicable aftermath. When the air had cleared and the ground had stopped shaking, they emerged cautiously, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What happened? What is this?" A voice cracked from the crowd. Trembling with disbelief, no one could answer. No one could explain the sudden and terrifying destruction that had come from nowhere, the strange energy that seemed to reverberate through the very air they breathed. But among them was one figure, an elder, a wise woman who had seen the old records of humanity's past. She had heard the ancient tales, the warnings passed down through generations. She had always believed that one day the legends would be proven true. She had always hoped that they were wrong. But now, standing in the midst of the ruins, she knew the truth. She knew what had happened. The child, the little girl they all knew so well, was not just a child. She was the last of a bloodline that had been hidden away, a lineage tied to the very forces that governed the universe itself. It wasn't just her innocence or her purity that had made her special. It was her connection to something far older and far more powerful than anything the galaxy had ever known. "The warning," the elder whispered, her voice barely audible above the hushed murmurs of the crowd. It was real. The others looked at her, eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "What do you mean?" One man asked. "What warning?" "The ancient warning," she continued, her voice trembling. "The one that said, harm a human child, and the universe would crumble." The realization hit the people of the colony like a wave crashing against the shore. The stories had been true. The legends, once thought to be nothing more than myths, had been right all along. The child, their child, had been the key, and they had been living under the protection of that very force for centuries, unaware of its true nature. The young girl, whose name was Ilara, was now the center of attention. But no one could approach her. The power she radiated kept them at a distance, as though the very air around her was charged with a force that would burn anyone who got too close. The elders spoke in hushed tones, exchanging fearful glances. Some wondered if they should protect her, keep her hidden away from the galaxy, from the powers that would seek to use her. Others whispered that she was the key to saving humanity from the impending destruction that now loomed on the horizon. But no one had the answers. Vrax, the warlord, and his soldiers were gone. The galaxy's most feared empire had been wiped out in an instant, and yet the power that had been unleashed wasn't done. It was still growing, still expanding. The universe had shifted, and now everything felt different. The laws of space, time, and reality were not what they once were. The energy Ilara had summoned had not only destroyed Vrax's fleet, it had altered the fabric of existence itself. Far across the stars, in distant reaches of the galaxy, the consequences of that shift were beginning to manifest. On a planet light years away, once stable celestial bodies began to shake, their orbits no longer predictable. Entire star systems that had been in perfect harmony for millennia were now shifting, colliding in a cosmic dance that defied all logic. The very stars were beginning to burn brighter, as though reacting to the same force that had surged through Ilara. Back on the colony, the elders convened, discussing what should be done next. They knew that the warning had been ignored, but they had no way of undoing what had been set into motion. The balance of the universe was disturbed, and it was too late to stop it. The child had awakened a force that would have repercussions across every corner of the galaxy. But there was still hope. The elders knew that Ilara was not alone in her connection to this power. There had been whispers, legends of other children like her, others who shared this ancient, untapped energy. They could feel the pull of it now, far beyond their world. It was a force that could either save them or bring about their ultimate destruction. Ilara, though, remained unaware of the full scope of what had just occurred. She stood quietly in the field, her tiny hands still raised as if in a prayer to some unseen force. The energy around her continued to pulse, growing stronger by the second. The universe was changing, and she, whether she understood it or not, was at the center of it all. And as the sun began to rise once more, casting light over the colony that had been spared from the destruction of the warlord, one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. As the days passed, the atmosphere on the colony became thick with a mixture of awe, fear, and uncertainty. The destruction that had unfolded before them, an alien warlord vanquished in the blink of an eye, an entire fleet wiped out by the power of a single child, was something they could scarcely comprehend. Ilara, the young girl at the center of it all, had become both a symbol of hope and a terrifying mystery. No one knew what she had awakened, nor what would happen next. The colony had settled into a strange, uneasy peace. The survivors tried to rebuild, their lives forever altered by the events they had witnessed. But even as they worked to clear the debris and restore their homes, they couldn't escape the feeling that the universe was still changing, still shifting around them. The very air seemed charged with an unnatural energy, and the ground beneath their feet hummed with a low, distant vibration. It was as if the fabric of reality itself had been torn, and now it was slowly trying to stitch itself back together. Ilara's presence was both a blessing and a curse. She no longer played in the fields like she once had. She was always watched, guarded by the elders, kept far from the crowds. Her powers were still growing, still unpredictable. And with every passing day, it became more evident that whatever had been unleashed when she had touched the soldiers, whatever had destroyed the warship and its crew, was not over. The energy she radiated was constant, a reminder to all who saw her that they were no longer in control of their destiny. The elders convened often, whispering in the shadows, trying to make sense of what had happened. They had always known that Ilara was special, but they hadn't understood the full extent of her power. The ancient texts, the warnings passed down through generations, spoke of a child who would awaken a force so great that it could either save or destroy the universe. But the details were vague, and no one had ever imagined that it could be true. Now, as the days wore on, they began to realize the truth of the warnings. The power Ilara held was not just a force, it was an anchor, a key to the balance of the entire galaxy. And the universe was already showing signs of the consequences. The elders knew that, in time, others would come for her. The forces of the galaxy, those who sought power, those who wished to control, would not simply let her live in peace. Ilara was the child of the prophecy, and there would be those who would stop at nothing to harness her abilities. But who could they trust? The galaxy was vast, and no one knew who might come next. Was there a way to protect Ilara? Was there a way to control the immense power she now held, to use it for good rather than destruction? Ilara herself seemed unaware of the danger she was in. She spent her days in quiet solitude, often staring at the horizon, her eyes distant, as if she were seeing something no one else could. She had become the focal point of a universe in turmoil, but she had no understanding of the power she commanded. Then, one day, a strange signal arrived. It was faint at first, barely a whisper through the galaxy's vast expanse, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. The elders gathered around their communications equipment, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end. This was no ordinary signal. It was not a distress call, nor was it an ordinary transmission. It was a message, a warning. She is awakening. The words crackled through the speakers, the message barely audible but unmistakable. The elders exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale. They had feared this moment, but they hadn't expected it so soon. The message came from deep within the galaxy, from a place beyond the reach of their world. It was clear now that whatever Ilara was, whatever she had awakened, was drawing attention from forces far beyond anything they had ever faced. And then, just as quickly as the message arrived, it stopped. Silence filled the room, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The elders knew that the warning was not meant for them alone. It was meant for the universe. The power Ilara had unleashed was not just something to be feared. It was something that would ripple out across the stars, affecting everything it touched. And the galaxy was now on the brink of a new war, a war that would be fought not with weapons or armies, but with the most ancient force in existence. Ilara's powers were growing stronger every day. The energy she radiated was no longer contained to the small colony where she had been born. The ripples of her awakening were now felt across the galaxy. The balance that had once held everything in place was beginning to unravel. Civilizations that had thrived for millennia began to experience strange phenomena. Stars going dark, planets shifting in their orbits, time itself bending in strange and unpredictable ways. The child had become the center of a cosmic storm, and there was no telling what would happen next. In the shadows, hidden from the eyes of the colony, a new figure began to stir, a figure who had watched Ilara from afar, who had been waiting for the right moment to make their move. They knew of the ancient bloodline she carried, and they knew the power she held. This figure had seen the signs, the strange events, the shifting stars, the disturbances in space-time. They understood what was happening, and they knew that Ilara was the key to everything. She could either bring about the rebirth of the universe or its destruction. The figure had their own plans. They would stop at nothing to claim Ilara's power, to bend it to their will. And they would not be deterred by the fragile defenses of a small human colony. The race was on, and soon, the true battle for the fate of the galaxy would begin. Meanwhile, on the colony, the elders continued to guard Ilara, though they knew their efforts were in vain. The galaxy was changing, and with every passing moment, they could feel the pull of something far larger than they were. No longer were they simply protecting a child. They were protecting the last hope for a universe on the edge of collapse. As Ilara stood quietly in the field, her small hands still outstretched as if reaching for something only she could see, the stars above them began to shimmer more brightly. A new chapter in the galaxy's history was about to unfold, and Ilara was at its center. The power that flowed through her was undeniable. It was unstoppable. But whether it would save or destroy everything they knew was a question that only time would answer. For now, all they could do was watch and wait.